So welcome everyone to this Refugee Initiative Conference panel session today on Afghan evacuations, mixed outcomes for the global refugee regime. We're here today to discuss 3 papers, and there's one discussant at the end of the 3 papers before we then go into the questions session. I do have a few house rules that I just want to run through for you. So we'll have the speakers today. They'll start us off with their presentation. It's 3 speakers, as I said. Everyone has 10 minutes, and we'll be keeping to those 10 minutes quite strictly so we can get through with everything. Just a reminder to everyone, please keep your microphones on mute and your videos off, unless you're a presenter and are presenting. For everyone else, the session is being recorded and will be posted on the RLI website as a podcast. So if you do not wish to appear in the podcast, then please leave the session now. If you wish to hide the live transcript at the bottom of your screen, please click the hide subtitles button. Okay, and then we'll start right in. So we'll start with our first speaker today, which is Naoko Hashimoto from the University of Hitotsubashi, and she'll be speaking to us today on her paper, Unregulated, Elitist and Fragmented, Tentative Findings from Afghan Evacuations to 4 Major Donor Countries. And I do hand over to you.
Right, thank you very much, Jasmine. Can you see my slide and can you hear me? I hope.
Yes, we can.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. Thank you very much. I know we have got other great panels running in parallel, but I would like to have a kind of to map out the kind of issues that this panel is going to focus on. That's about basically direct evacuation of Afghan people after the fall of the country to Taliban. And those people have been exposed to well-funded fear of being persecuted because of their affiliation with various foreign entities, such as ISAF troops or embassies. And this kind of direct evacuation of vulnerable individuals is not necessarily new, because, for example, during the late 70s, we had, or like 80s and 90s, we had the orderly departure program from Vietnam. And also, at least, if you only talk about the so-called evacuation of ex-Afghan interpreters, the US government, as well as the UK government, have been doing this at least for the past 20 years. But what is new since last year, especially in terms of Afghanistan, is that many more countries, such as South Korea, by the way, the photograph on the right is the evacuation of 380 Afghan people who used to work for South Korean government. And so there's a new kind of trend that kind of that I would say there's an increasing norm accepted by a variety of countries that we would have to rescue the people who have worked with kind of international forces and foreign entities. Right. The problems that I have observed is this. So basically, this kind of direct evacuation of people who have well-funded fear of being persecuted from the country of origin, there is no international regulation regarding these operations. It falls completely outside the at least traditional mandates of UNHCR or IOM. Therefore, the 2 global compacts do not have any reference to this kind of operations. This obviously the reason is this. So this falls completely outside of any traditional asylum or displacement regimes. Yes, there is this IDP regime, but some of the Afghan people are not displaced at all, even internally. They are kind of internally stuck. Some of them they have a real security issue, therefore they are stuck even at home. And yes, we have been seeing this. I mean, whenever we talk about asylum, usually we are talking about territorial asylum in the sense of protecting some like foreign nationals appearing in the jurisdiction of your country or third countries And as opposed to that, some Latin American countries have been conducting this diplomatic asylum in the sense of like Julian Assange, for example, taking refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, but this diplomatic asylum regime is only applicable to the Latin American countries that have ratified a specific regional convention. So there's no universal applicability of this diplomatic asylum regime. Therefore, the operations, the selection eligibility, and entitlements or rights upon arrival at the host countries have been rather fragmented. And I would say that obviously these Afghan people who used to work for foreign forces or foreign embassies or, for example, development agencies, they are in a sense the best and the brightest, they're elites. But then does it actually crystallize the recent sort of neoliberal trend of admitting only the best and the brightest via pre-arrival selection procedures? And then this kind of a trend has been observable through, for example, resettlement or complementary pathway routes as well. And also this evacuation has got rather critical implications for the post-conflict reconstruction, all the more because we are talking about exodus of the elite people who have been actually running the country. And then, for example, our discussant today has been a high official for the the previous Afghan government. So there's a sort of huge, negative, it could be negative implications for the future of Afghanistan. And then, because of all these reasons, there's been rather extremely scant academic discussions on this issue, except for Claire Higgins, who was supposed to be on the panel, but for various reasons he couldn't be here. But then this kind of situation has been called rather, for example, through the term of in-country asylum processing or protected entry procedures, but we still haven't got lots of academic discussions going on. Then I don't have the time to go through this chart, but then what I have been trying to do is the kind of mapping out of the framework, eligibility criteria, and status, the entitlements upon arrival, and the numbers among the major donors. And they are not only so-called major financial donors, but they have been kind of truth contributing countries to ISAF. And I would say that the emerging norm is that as long as the Afghan local people were working for the foreign entities for a substantial period of time with a substantial money kind of duties, then many governments have tried to admit them and provide kind of permanent or resettlement status upon arrival. However, the biggest problem for me is the very restrictive eligibility criteria that the Japanese government applied for those people who used to work for the Japanese embassy or Japanese, JICA, the development agency, or NGOs. Probably I don't have the time to go through everything, but then basically we have seen two completely separate categories. One is government-sponsored evacuees, and the other is private-sponsored evacuees. And it has been almost impossible for those who couldn't join the government sponsorship program to even to apply for visa using the private-sponsored evacuation program. Therefore, even if Japan has been one of the biggest donors to Afghanistan for the past 20 years, the evacuation number has only amounted to 740, which is absolutely insufficient. So my problem of my kind of going forward in terms of my my research is this. So in terms of praxis, practice, it is obviously very difficult to realize the direct evacuation because of the security concern. And because that's first point. And the second point is that because all these Afghan local staff have almost equal persecution threat, regardless of the countries of the organization for which they have been working. But and all the more for this, I think there's a need for coordination and harmonization at the international level, but who could lead the process? And another kind of chilling effect, in my opinion, is the kind of, it sounds as if those local staff are welcome to come to the third country because of their previous contribution to the third country. And the South Korean example that I mentioned is that they were called not refugees, but rather special contributors to the South Korean society. Is it good or not? That's a debate. And also, when we talk about this direct evacuation, it's kind of difficult. It's very difficult to identify what kind of disciplines, what kind of theories, what kind of conceptual framework that the research should adapt. And then as a researcher, I feel rather embarrassed to admit this, but then I haven't really been able to identify the correct or the proper theoretical framework. So I would very much welcome any suggestions that you may have. Methodology, because of, again, the security concern of individuals and also highly kind of confidential information, it has been very difficult for me also to either interview or have the comprehensive statistics of the evacuees, also to have to interview the decision makers. So how can we have a proper methodological approach to the research? That's my challenge. And also which level analysis we could also, of course, we can adapt a kind of global comparative research, but because this evacuation program is very much decided at the national level, I'm also kind of at a loss which kind of level analysis I should adapt. So I think this is it, and I have to rush a bit, but I very much welcome any suggestions or questions that you may have at the end of the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Naoko Hashimoto. Just a quick, I realised I've forgotten to point out before we move on to the next speaker, that for the attendees, the questions will be posted in the chat booth, so just type them in there. We'll get to your questions at the end of the panel after everyone has spoken. Our next speaker is Professor William Maley, who's from the Australian National University, and will be presenting a paper titled Paradoxes of Preventive Evacuation, Some Lessons from Afghanistan 2021. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be able to join this particular panel dealing with a very important issue, actually. One of the things that animated our discussion of the issue that is the focus of our presentation was the paradox that, on the one hand, in 2021, as the situation unraveled in Afghanistan, it became very clear that there would be people who would be acutely vulnerable in the event of a Taliban takeover, but that the initiation of a major evacuation could be the last straw that would break the back of the Republican system in Afghanistan. And this was something that weighed heavily in the mind of the president of Afghanistan when he was in the United States in mid-2021. There's a lot of theory that underpins this, particularly the work on cascades by Timur Kuran, who makes the point that in places like Afghanistan, but in many others, people position themselves not just on the strength of what they would like to see happen, but on the strength of what they think is likely to happen, given the motivations and positionings of other people. And in that, the United States certainly failed to grasp this when they signed a peace agreement with the Taliban, and it loomed very prominently in the thinking of people in the Afghan government for obvious reasons. This then gave rise to the question of how one might set about preparing to assist those who would be vulnerable by virtue of their association with foreign governments without contributing to the triggering of a sort of landslide that would sweep away what was left of the system. And this became a focal point for some discussions that we had at the academic level in Australia in the first half of 2021, when it was clear to us, although not obvious apparently to the government, that a collapse could easily take place quite quickly. And the main participants were Professor Susan Harris-Rimmer of Griffith University, myself, and Professor John Blaxland, Professor of Strategic Studies at the Australian National University, who had also been a diplomat in the past. And what we sought to tease out, with a view to presenting it to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, was an approach that could prepare for a significant evacuation in a principled fashion without necessarily becoming a trigger point for disastrous unintended political consequences. What we ended up drafting was a set of proposals which, as things turned out, were aborted. They were aborted because the Australian government, with 5 days' notice, closed the embassy in Kabul in the last week of May 2021. And what we had been anticipating was really dependent upon the continuation of a functioning embassy, which of course was the case with the United States and many other countries that had missions in Afghanistan. Nonetheless, some of the points that we addressed, I think, are interesting to share, since they could potentially be of value in other environments where political circumstances begin to unravel. Firstly, we saw it as important to identify from a principal point of view what might be the principal categories of people who might require evacuation. And here, this is touching on one of the lacunae that Naoko highlighted in her presentation. We thought it would likely be necessary for domestic political reasons in resettling states to go beyond simply the definition of refugee in the 1951 convention. Australia had historically had an in-country special humanitarian program, which does still operate for people who have a fear of gross discrimination and human rights violations. But it was also recognised that there were people who would have a claim to Australian protection because of vulnerabilities that might not rise to the level of creating refugee identity, but which nonetheless would be morally important for an Australian government to recognise. And here, I think a relative philosophical position is that was outlined by F.H. Bradley in the 19th century in his famous essay, My Station and Its Duties, which makes the point that one can, by virtue of one's connectedness to other people, acquire responsibilities that may be significant, even if they don't necessarily fit all that comfortably within some global ethic of a consequentialist or deontological variety. What we foreshadowed was that the Australian government might seek to reach out to people in Afghanistan who were undoubtedly vulnerable, with a suggestion that the government was considering the possibility of making visitors' visas to Australia available for people who had prior connections. That this had not necessarily been finalised, but that with a view to making it a workable system, it was useful for Australia to gather certain amounts of information in advance, which could allow such a system to be smoothly implemented. And there were critical sources of or types of information which we thought it would be useful to collect in such a process. Contact details, both email addresses and mobile phone numbers, details on family membership, passport numbers, and if possible, photocopies of identity pages within passports, information about contacts in Australia whom it would be important to keep informed about how the processing of visas might be carried forward. And the notion here was that this information could be used to establish a database with the functionality to underpin subsequent crisis email or SMS communications with people in Australia, in Afghanistan, a country in which there was a very high level of mobile phone ownership and familiarity with these modes of communication amongst people who were likely to be vulnerable in the event of a Taliban takeover. Getting a sense of the numbers of people who might be interested, since some people could potentially be approached with offers of assistance from more than one country. It could then be possible to do more detailed and systematic planning about transport to evacuation points and preparation of identification documents that people could be using at transport points that would be recognized by people who are not immigration or foreign affairs officials, but who were perhaps guards whom we know it was very difficult for people to navigate when they got to the fringes of Hamid Karzai International Airport in August 2021. Now, this didn't eventuate, of course. It was partly because of the close of the embassy, but I think it was also because politically there was not much animation within the Australian government to recognise that this was a problem until public opinion began to get very vociferous in August 2021. There had been in 2012, under a previous government, a legislative instrument put in place which was designed to facilitate the resettlement of locally engaged employees of the Australian government. But the key expression here was employees, because the bulk of people who had worked for Australian projects within Afghanistan were legally contractors rather than employees. And many of them received information from the Australian government to the effect that because they were not employees, they were not eligible for resettlement under that program. That constraint needed to be dumped in August because public opinion was outraged at the notion that contractors who had put their lives on the line might be at risk. And even a former prime minister denounced it as unsatisfactory legalism under the circumstances. But the level of unreality that was prevalent can perhaps be ascertained best from a suggestion after the closure of the embassy by an official before a Senate committee hearing that people who did receive such locally engaged employee visas could then use commercial flights to travel to Australia. And of course, when war breaks out with a vengeance, commercial flights are often the first casualty, and that was certainly the case at Kabul airport from 15th, 16th of August onwards. I think this is not a magic solution. What will work will depend upon the prevailing situation, the technologies and the networks in particular countries. But the wider lesson, I think, is that through not thinking of these sorts of things, when the crisis hit in August 2021, the government was singularly unprepared, and this should not have been the case. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor William Maley, for this wonderful presentation. We'll now move to our last paper presentation of this session, and it's a co-authored paper which will be presented. We're very fortunate to have three of the authors presenting today, which is Professor Adele Gagne, Dr. Ingen Björkhauk, and Dr. Astrid Espergren. And there's a fourth author, which is not present today, that's Professor Christine Sandvik. So I'll hand over to you.
Sorry, I was having trouble with sharing. It should be fine now that I've done this before. Right, so can everyone hear me fine? Yes, great. So we are going to talk about in our paper, so shifting politics of vulnerability as far as skilled Afghan women are concerned in the context of evacuation, and we're going to focus on the link as well between evacuation and resettlement. So this is speaking to concerns that also Nauko mentioned in the first paper. So I won't spend too much time on the circumstances of the evacuation because that's really the topic of the panel, and Nauko presented it and William Maley as well. But just to shed the light on the situation of women in Afghanistan, which was already very, very difficult before the Taliban takeover in August 2021, but has been considerably worsening since. And in August, people were extremely concerned about the situation of skilled women who had acquired a lot of professional skills and experience in the 20 years of the American and NATO occupation. So there was a focus on this, and this is what we are going to examine, and with the use of a concept that especially Ingrid and Astrid have been developed, that is called brain save. And whether this concept can help us label this shift that we might be observing in terms of the women that we look at when we consider refugee resettlement. So first, as Nauko said, evacuations are not refugee resettlement because they focus either on particular categories of people, as we saw the helpers of the governments, or also groups of population who need to be brought to safety very quickly. And so the question of the legal definition of a refugee isn't really there yet in the space when we discuss evacuations. However, amongst the more than 120,000 Afghans that were evacuated, many have since been resettled to resettlement countries, including what we're looking at here in the US, Norway, Canada, Australia, as was also mentioned by Professor Mali. And so there is a distributive impact of evacuation on resettlement and resettlement quotas. But we want to note as well that a few have also been granted asylum. So it has a broader impact on the politics of protection, but still this link is quite interesting. And also what is interesting now is that refugee resettlement traditionally, as we've shown in previous work, is humanitarian governance in terms of categorizing the beneficiaries of refugee resettlement. Vulnerability, of course, is at the core of refugee resettlement. So now we are going to look at how this has evolved in the context of the focus and discussion practices of the protecting skilled Afghan women. And I'm handing over the word to Ingrid.
So there are three questions we grapple with in this paper and in this context described by Adele. And one is, what does a new focus on skills mean for the dominant framing of women as vulnerable in resettlement? And does this challenge or consolidate notions of deservingness? The second question is the concept introduced as well, which is, what is brain save? The third question is, what kind of advocacy argument is the brain save argument, and what are the consequences for protection of capacity and skills, and what are the possible trade-offs? Yes, the next slide is just briefly mention the women at risk category that most of you are probably familiar with. It has gradually evolved from the 1980s. And from the perspective of UNHCR, women at risk is mainly designated to provide a tool to protect women who are single-headed of families perceived as extremely vulnerable. They may suffer from a range of problems such as sexual harassment, violence, abuse, torture, and exploitations. However, we have found no policy discussion of resettlement needs specifically arising from women's educational background or professional status. This is new, and this has led us into following discussion about skilled and educated women as vulnerable because of who they are. We are asking if we are witnessing a change from a traditional view of women as vulnerable to women as vulnerable due to their own achieved position and education, and if so, is it relevant to discuss how this can challenge the established views of the vulnerable refugee women? What we find interesting is what you also have mentioned before in the presentation, is the chaos the Afghan days of evacuation provided. And it was not the UNHCR, but mainly diplomatic and military actors, in addition to NGOs, private initiatives, individuals and journalists who identified who they found deserving of protection and evacuation. And they are also the actors who mainly provoked a special focus on skilled women. So to investigate the questions in our paper, we have selected 4 examples to illustrate how this new focus on women during the Afghan evacuation is communicated in the public debates.
And the first example is the Afghan robotic team known as the Afghan Dreamers, consisting of high school students between the ages of 13 and 18. The team was formed with the help from the US organization Digital Citizen Fund, DCF, and it was the DCF who evacuated the team to Qatar and Mexico in mid-August. Our second example is the Zora All-Women's Orchestra, consisting of girls aged between 13 and 20. A group of US lawmakers and other American politicians and military officials came together to help the members evacuate in early September, but the attempt failed. Later, in the beginning of October, some members were successfully evacuated to Qatar with the help, amongst others, of American cellist Yo-Yo Ma and the government of Qatar. And this group is now in Portugal. The third example is the Afghan national women's football team. The members of the team were evacuated to Australia with the help of several prominent former sporting figures and the FIFPro, the Worldwide Association for Professional Footballers. And our fourth and final examples concern judges and women lawyers. Resettlement efforts for this group was largely driven by the legal profession itself. For example, the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute organized the evacuation of 103 women judges, lawyers, journalists, and other human activists to Greece, and some of them are now resettled in Australia. And these four examples represent Afghan women within high-tech, culture, sports, and law. And as such, they are all in various ways symbols of the modern Afghanistan and development in Afghanistan the last 20 years. These examples also illustrate how the frames of deservingness seems to be decoupled from the more traditional concerns with victimhood to focus on skills, talents, and accomplishments in non-traditional women's spheres, such as law, robotic, classical music, and soccer. And the examples also illustrate the role of civil society in identifying those in need of evacuation and resettlement. We argue that these examples are indicative of a conceptual shift, which we label brain save. So what is brain save? Well, brain save is different from the more established concept of brain drain, whereas the concept of brain drain is used to describe migration from countries short of skills and competences needed to meet future challenges. Brain save refers to the resettlement of refugees who are unwanted and or perceived as a threat by their country of origin. In contrast to brain drain, the concept of brain save implies more positive associations. This entails saving the competence, capacity, and aspiration of Afghan women. The other concept we'll compare brain save to is what has been referred to as cherry picking or refugee shopping, or selecting refugees with higher education and thus an assumed higher potential to integrate into the labor market. Brain save is different from cherry picking in that it's not about picking refugees who are profitable, but resettling people who are vulnerable due to their skills and expertise. A more concrete distinction between the two is that the label cherry picking has mostly been related to a top-down process, as it has been linked to the national eligibility criteria of receiving states, and particularly that of integration potential. The brain save argument, on the other hand, as shown in our examples, has mostly been a bottom-up argument, with civil society actors advocating for specific groups or individuals they believe to be subjected to persecution.
So, moving towards the end of this presentation, let's talk a little bit about the possible trade-offs of protection of skills and capacity. During the Afghan evacuation, the linkages between education and skills and deservingness represent a new advocacy argument. But if the emphasis on capacity and skills is coupled with a failure to expand refugee slots significantly, the burden on refugee hosting countries will increase. The new focus on protecting women, professional women, and the need to save the brains of female refugees can be perceived as a development towards a more individual assessment of refugee women vulnerability. However, one trade-off can be that women already selected to be resettled under traditional criteria is at risk of being pushed back in the resettlement queue.
And so I'm sorry, I'm having trouble with my computer today. So I'm just going to finish on the takeaways because the questions are more, the takeaways I want to. So it's that the emerging category of skilled refugees can be problematic, yes, but it can also create a legacy where women will be construed as candidates for resettlement equally with men. So it opens potentially new opportunities. We also saw that gender now plays a role in discussions of brain safe and resettlement cooperation that it did not prior to the Taliban takeover. So it's sort of a new conversation. And the question is whether the agency of skilled refugee women will play a greater role in future policy formulation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for those three very important reflections on the Afghan evacuation. Before we move to the discussion, I just want to remind everyone attending that you have the possibility to put your questions into the chat box right here. Yes, Sarah just highlighted that again, so please write your questions in there. We'll come to the questions at the end of the discussant's presentation that will be now. So we have the pleasure to have Ahmed Shuja Jamal to act as a discussant today. He'll be tying together those three presentations in his reflection. So I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Jasmine. It's a pleasure to be here and to be speaking about the three excellent papers that were presented today. I'll add some comments from a sort of ground level practical perspective, including from a personal perspective. I was in Kabul when the Taliban forcefully took Kabul and saw everything firsthand and was part of the process of evacuation. For the first paper, Dr. Hashimoto rightly points out that there is a dearth of academic discussion on this particular matter, and I'll add a comment to a dimension that is similarly less explored. I think the evacuations in the last 2 weeks of August particularly had a very strong aspect of network effect. And what I mean by that is that as a person wishing to be evacuated, the more people you knew on the other side of the infamous Abbey Gate, which is on the other side of the airport where the flights were happening, or the more people you knew who knew people on the other side, the more likely you were to be rescued. And so what this means is that your risk profile is a matter, but it is one of multiple matters, one of multiple reasons that would lead to your evacuation successfully from Kabul in those 2 weeks of August. And this has equity implications for women, equity implications for minorities, and people living outside of Kabul and people without a champion, such as the US State Department, the US military, the Australian military, who would have the necessary pull to effect your evacuation. So if you're a woman, a minority, people outside of Kabul, or somebody who lacked the champion inside on the other side of the Abbey Gate, you were less likely to be evacuated because of that very strong network effect that was operating on the ground. There are also implications for whether the process continues to get to people who are most in need and at risk now that the evacuations from Kabul airport are over. So what that means is that there are implications for how elitist and or best and brightest the process really got to, which means if you had more connections on the other side, you were more likely to be evacuated, regardless of how bright and best you were, or regardless of how much at risk you were. Professor Hashimoto also talked about a lack of or a need for coordination and harmonization. I think this is an important point in the sense that the responsibility sharing implications that it has is immense in emergency evacuation processes in the future. Kabul was lucky because the US had as many as 5,000 Marines at the airport, which gave other governments like Canada, the UK, and Australia a foothold to do their own evacuations from the security bubble created by the US Marines in Kabul airport. But that was really just a happy byproduct, a helpful bug and not a feature, if you will, of the evacuation process. So harmonization and coordination in the future will be critically important in avoiding contingencies where nations with fewer resources might not be able to take up their responsibility in an emergency situation elsewhere. Coming to Professor Maley's presentation, I think the tension between setting off a panic versus evacuating those at risk in an orderly fashion is real. I would add that to a certain extent, in Kabul. I was there in those final months and weeks in Kabul, but also in Afghanistan. Obviously, there was desperation building up, but everyone knew for years that the US had been conducting evacuations under the SIV program. And it was not my sense that those evacuations had created a particular panic among people who were in Kabul. The panic was related to, but not caused by that evacuation. Canada, for example, had been evacuating hundreds of Afghans in the week prior to the collapse. However, in my workplace, which was the Afghan government, panic really started to set in around 12th or the 13th of August, when Canada announced that it would take 20,000 Afghans from Kabul. And that was really in the context of multiple provinces around Kabul beginning to fall in a domino fashion. And so the combination of provinces falling really quickly and the Canadian evacuation of 20,000 Afghans, which means there's a risk, but also a way out, that led to colleagues from multiple ministries in the government reaching out to me, because I had the international affairs portfolio, to connect them to the Canadian embassy for evacuation processes even before the fall of Kabul. So, of course, this does not obviate the need for preparedness in the ways that Professor Maley pointed out. If anything, it reinforces that need, but it does mean that context and general psychology can be as important as they sense that a mass evacuation is happening in shaping public psychology writ large. And with respect to the third presentation, I will share an anecdote I received after I was evacuated from Kabul in the first few days after the forceful takeover of the Taliban by the Taliban. I received multiple inquiries from several embassies inquiring about a number of women who had been in high-profile positions. In one case, one of the women who was being sought by these embassies had already been evacuated, and in another case, the woman actually chose to stay in Kabul, even as embassies were looking for a way to evacuate her. And so I think at the same time, I received, and I'm pretty sure that many people on this panel and audiences listening or watching this panel also received inquiries from panicked women at risk who had nowhere to go and who were not being sought by embassies for evacuation. So what this indicates is that to the extent that there is a conceptual shift to a brain save, that shift creates real equity implications because of a strong operation of network effect in the chaotic evacuation process in Afghanistan. And that is something that I think we need to consider in potential coordination exercises in the future outside of the Afghan context. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's fantastic. It's, I think, very important to get those reflections on those papers. I think for the minute we do not have any questions in the chat box. If there's anything that I cannot see, please do alert me to it. I would otherwise suggest, as maybe those attending will form their questions, I would give the speakers the chance to respond to those reflections which Jamal has just shared. So if we maybe want to go around the panels and allow speakers to respond to those reflections, I think that would be in the meantime, and if some questions come in the meantime as well, if the presenters have questions to each other, I'd give that the opportunity as well. So if we want to start with you, Dr. Hashimoto, if you want to respond to those reflections, then we'll go around and see if questions further come in the meantime.
Thank you. I see a question from Sarah. Thank you. If I may just read, thank you for everyone. If there's any useful framework that could be used to frame eligibility criteria for applications in a rights-based approach, but also that is yes. I had to rush my presentation, but usually as far as US, UK, Germany, Canada, Australia are concerned, I mean, Professor Maley could correct me if I'm wrong, but again, usually the local staff would have to be would have to have worked longer than 1 year. 1 year is really shortest kind of cutoff. And also they would have to demonstrate a kind of vulnerability. Plus, usually they have to work, they have to be employed directly rather than as a kind of subcontractor. These are the kind of emerging sort of criteria, I mean, common criteria that I see, but that's completely outside the normal. I mean, okay, sure, all of them have well-founded fear of being persecuted. That's for sure. But other than that, in terms of the family unification rights, I mean, I'm talking about selection criteria. I'm not, because the usually, apart from Japan, which I couldn't go into detail, but then usually the kind of entitlement status rights granted to those evacuees upon arrival at the final destination is that usually they were given the same rights entitlements as normal, I mean, regular resettlement refugees. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know whether I've answered Sarah's question, but I mean, that's the only kind of emerging kind of common denominator, if you like, I've sort of found through my very preliminary research. Thank you.
Yes, please, Dr. Miley.
Yes, just on this particular point of the distinction between employees and contractors, there's no doubt that it's one that states have used at different stages to try, in a sense, to shrink the pool of people who might have claims on them. But the Afghanistan case, I think, shows rather clearly that it's a pretty meaningless distinction when one's talking about vulnerability, because you can have somebody who's a long-term employee in a very low-profile position who is probably at significantly less risk than somebody who might have been a contractor but right out there and visible to the enemy as somebody associated prominently with the activities of the particular donor state. And this was a point which was forcefully made in Australia in August 2021 by people who had been involved in aid delivery within Afghanistan, who saw real threats to their locally contracted partners. And the government did back away from that after it became clear that the paradoxical consequences of enforcing this particular distinction, which might have made a bit of sense in the gig economy in Australia, but didn't make much sense in rural Afghanistan, could be politically damaging for the government. If I could also make just one point about the bottom-up brain save argument, which I think is a fascinating and important one. That was absolutely the case in Australia. For example, members of the Zora Orchestra were very much advantaged by the fact that Dr. Samas, the director of the Afghanistan National Institute of Music, had that particular group of musicians touring Australia in 2019 on the 50th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations. And he himself was a PhD graduate of Monash University and who was very well connected. So there were plenty of people who were already animated to try to do something on behalf of these particular people. But it means that when we're talking about networks, and Shuja is absolutely right in highlighting this, the networks can actually be quite diffuse. They can be community networks in countries that are contemplating some kind of evacuation, who may be articulate and well connected, not within Afghanistan, but within capital cities in Canberra, Tokyo, Washington, London, wherever. And that can then feed into the environment in which decisions are being made about who might be rescued in a rescue process. The final point I'd make is that there is, in the Australian case, an ongoing program for people to apply for resettlement to Australia, which in its scale vastly exceeds the number of people who were brought out as part of an emergency evacuation. Indeed, people who were given so-called 442 visas to be extracted from Afghanistan but weren't able to get out have now been told that they should apply for that other program. There are problems with that relating to the huge number of applications that have been received. But I think it is worth mentioning that emergency evacuations don't necessarily exhaust the scope of what states might be doing if they are looking at providing pathways to resettlement for people who are vulnerable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, I will hand over to Professor Gagne. I believe there's Nicholas Maple has just posted a second question as well, which will get around advances as well, if you want to reflect on both those questions. If that would be perfect.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll speak to Sarah's question, Sarah Singer's, because I don't have in mind an example of a good evacuation, but it's a good question. But for instance, yes, that speaks to things that have been mentioned by Professor Mali as well, and by Professor Hashimoto, and by Dr. Shuza Jama as well, which is that Canada, for instance, it's interesting. I didn't think of that. I'm based in Canada, and you know that it was an election campaign, and it was very similar to what happened with the Syrian campaign, where they also made this as a part of an election campaign. And after the election, the 20,000 places doubled to 40,000 places, and there are several streams. So there is for Canada, there is a family unification stream for families of former interpreters of 5,000 places, 18,000 places for personnel who have assisted the efforts in Afghanistan. And then the rest of that stream, so the rest of the 40,000, is a mix of privately sponsored and government-sponsored refugees. The issue is, of course, that Canada doesn't have an in-country program like Australia has. It has been abolished by the Harper government, meaning that if they haven't been evacuated in the evacuation operation, they have to be resettled from a third country. And this is given as a motive at the moment for the fact that resettlement from Afghanistan or admission from Afghan people who are fleeing the country at the moment is severely delayed. The other thing that I found very interesting in the comments, and also in the comment that Professor Male made, is that yes, so the networks effects. I think what we said was about cases of women who were part of the evacuations. However, the same brain safe argument also can apply to women who were stuck in Afghanistan for weeks and months because they could not evacuate through Kabul airport because they were at higher risk than others to be identified and at risk of violence by the Taliban forces. So yes, and that includes women in Kabul, but also women in the regions. Definitely there is a distributive effect here as well of these elitist policies. And the last point I just wanted to take, because we have to take this also in a context where the focus now at the level of international politics, I think, has shifted to Ukrainians who are largely women and children. And for us, it leads, as well to questions of the distributive impact and the brain safe argument in this context as well. I think I'll stop here, and perhaps Ingun and Astrid want to add some of that as well. Thank you very much for your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Gagne. I do want to, anyone of the co-author co-presenters would like to present any reflections? Aspen and Bob Haug.
Yeah, I'm okay. Astrid, do you have any comments?
I just wanted to add that I also find this network, well, bringing it up is really important. And of course, we see within the civil society actors that have been actively involved in identifying these examples that we showed. This is a result of these like the Sura Orchestra having networks. Also the Afghan robotic team, who has also been touring around different sort of national international competitions, and of course have a great network. And the civil society actors that were involved were also quite sort of prominent people. Yeah, so thank you for that, for those comments, both Professor Meli and Ms. Jamal.
Thank you very much. Dr. Hashimoto, I see your video is on. That indicates to me you want to respond, and I'll give that to you.
Thank you. I just wanted to echo this network effect, because again, I didn't have the time, but then even Japan, because the eligibility criteria for government-sponsored evacuees were so narrow that many ex-Afghan, especially ex-Afghan local staff working for the Japanese NGOs had to rely on this network. So many of actually my friends who used to work, Japanese friends who used to work for Japanese NGOs in Afghanistan, they became the private sponsors. Probably for the first time, I've seen this kind of strong bottom-up approach to rescue the vulnerable individuals from bottom-up kind of privately led initiative. I think probably that's the first time in the history of Japanese sort of refugee protection. I see Nicholas' excellent question about this kind of any precedents for good evacuation. The only example that I can think of off the top of my head is again Vietnamese orderly departure program, which is kind of history. But again, I see that the only reason why it was good and orderly was probably because there was a full agreement with the basically Vietnamese government. Now we cannot have that kind of agreement with Taliban. Again, Shuja, correct me if I'm wrong, but then I heard that Taliban actually asked the Japanese government not to evacuate people, or in the pretext that Japan is basically facilitating brain drain, whatever. So yeah, so ODP, but I can, yeah, okay. I see Professor Malley's hand, so I hand over to you, Professor Malley. Thank you.
Thank you. I certainly can't think of an example of a good evacuation if we're talking about an emergency evacuation of the sort that we saw in Kabul. If you think back to Saigon in 1975, there was a lot that was extremely chaotic then, and the Australian government won sort of permanent notoriety by declining to evacuate locally employed staff of the Australian Embassy in Saigon, but finding space for a basket of cats that were the pets of a European official who was being flown out at the time, and that was a pretty grim exercise. I think one of the problems in running a good evacuation is that the bureaucratic structures of Western states often fragment responsibilities which need to be brought together to make an evacuation work. So it's relatively common to find that the visa issuing function is being discharged from people who are quite different from those who are running embassies on the ground, or who are responsible for military and logistical support. And unless they've done a lot of pre-planning, which was actually recommended in the Australian case by a parliamentary committee in 2012, only for nothing to be done in the intervening 9 years, then it's likely that things will get extremely messy on the ground when an evacuation actually occurs, that the left hand won't know what the right hand is doing, that documents that have been issued by one element of a state's bureaucracy will not be recognized or accepted by some other element. And there was plenty of evidence of that at the boundary of Kabul airport, where essentially junior soldiers who had no bureaucratic experience had no real preparation for recognizing what might have been a genuine visa from one that might not have had that status. So I don't think there's any happy model to which we can point in the past, and that certainly highlights the need for better preparation for the future.
Thank you, Professor Malley. Yes, Professor Gani, I think your hand was up. I'll hand over to you.
I just wanted to make a comment in relation to what Professor Malley said, because this aspect have been criticized. So the interministerial lack of communication in the Canadian case has been criticized in a parliamentary report that the Parliament of Canada just released, analyzing the Canadian evacuations, and that's a great report to read because they make recommendations for future evacuations. So that can be interesting to read there. And more related to our point, this report also points out that the streams that the Canadian government has made for the different categories of Afghans don't include gender-based violence towards women, but just with women activists. So there is this elitist bent to it. So these two things have been already discussed. So I'm not really aware whether other evacuation countries have done such parliamentary report, but I really recommend reading this one. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So as far as I can see, there have not been any further questions coming in from the audience. Is any of the five speakers, the discussant, want to add something, any word, ask questions? Okay, yes, please.
I'll just add two anecdotes here. I think both of them support the idea of preparedness in cases like this. Number one was that I was one of the first people that happened to be around the infamous Abbey Gate, which was the scene of the August 27th, I believe, terrorist attack, but also the scene of many desperate attempts to get into the Kabul airport for evacuation. And in those early hours of August 15th of 2021, what you saw was a state of flux within the NATO mission in Kabul, where prior to the arrival of American Marines, the perimeter security responsibility for the airport was for the Turkish soldiers, the contingent from the Turkish soldiers. And as the American Marines started arriving, for the next few 10 to 12 hours, it became unclear as to who had final authority in authorizing entrance into the airport. And so very high level NATO civilian officials were unable to grant access to certain people who waited for hours outside of that Abbey Gate. And so the chaos that resulted from operational unpreparedness resulted in many deserving people who were at risk to continue to be outside those gates and exposed to multiple kinds of risks. And also as a byproduct of the American Marines taking over in their thousands in a very compressed amount of time was the stoppage of civil aviation at Kabul airport, because so many American soldiers were coming into the airport, which meant that civil aviation, to the extent that it was still operating in those final hours of Kabul airport being still functional and operational, was stopped. Which led to the unhelpful result of hundreds of Afghans not being able to leave Kabul. And I seem to have a distinct memory of a woman, a middle-aged woman, who had one child in her lap and another child who was 3 years old, as she said, who had been lost in the chaos. The woman and her children, her two daughters, actually had a ticket to leave Kabul airport that afternoon, but because of the ban on commercial aviation by the incoming US Marines, who required the airspace to themselves, this woman had been left behind like hundreds of other people at that airport on that day. And in that chaos, this woman had actually lost her 3-year-old daughter, and she was running around asking the US Marines and other people as to whether they saw a 3-year-old girl on the tarmac on that night. Between the 15th and the 16th of August. So all of these two anecdotes are to suggest, to indicate that preparedness is really important, and that shortcomings in operational preparedness can have real life implications for people on the ground who need to be evacuated. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those extremely important reflections. Professor Maley has.
Yes, I see we have another question from Nicholas about whether the idea of safe zones ever comes up in these evacuation. And there is some discussion, but one needs to be very careful about the idea of a safe zone, because attempting to establish a safe zone can mean that the immediate perimeter is very unsafe, which was the experience when the terrorist attack that Shuja mentioned at the perimeter of Kabul airport actually took place. One needs to be very, very clear about exactly who is responsible for what, and what criteria will govern the management of the safe zone before it can be used without being potentially a source of unintended consequences as well. So that's not to say it may not be a useful idea in certain circumstances, but one needs to avoid just sort of throwing up a legal designation of a particular area as a safe zone, because if there aren't steps physically taken to make it safe, it can end up attracting large numbers of people who come in who then can be targeted by vicious forces for some kind of spectacular mass atrocity attack.
Thank you very much. Dr. Hashimoto, is there? Yes.
Yeah, I have a question to Shuja, because he's yeah, I'm sorry, I'm kind of stepping away from my role as a polemist. But by the way, the safe zone thing, I completely agree with Professor Mali. Shuja, I kind of addressed this in my presentation, but the Afghan people, like including high official like you, those people who have well-founded fear of persecution would have to be definitely evacuated. That's no, I think that's universal understanding in my opinion. But how do you see long-term implications for the country, for Afghanistan? Because as I said, for example, as Adele's paper, demonstrated, women judges were evacuated, and someone like you, actually, I'm happy for you that you're in Australia, but I'm a bit ambivalent in terms of, okay, so what my question is, how do you see we are moving forward in terms of the long-term future of Afghanistan, if you can answer? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hashimoto. I think I share your ambivalence, because I was in Kabul until the very last possible moment, until it became impossible to be there. I think, and there were many thousands of other Afghans who were in that same place who wanted to make a life or make a contribution towards the future of that country in their own ways. I think it is, we have multiple strains of arguments that have emerged after the forceful takeover of Kabul and Afghanistan by the Taliban. One of these strains is, let's empower the moderate Taliban. And the other strain is, let's give the Taliban some more time for them to figure things out in terms of governance and human rights. And the third strain, which is really a variation of the first two, is, if we continue to engage with the Taliban, they will change. And I think what we've seen over the past 10 months is that in an organization that is extremist by its very DNA and constitution, there are no moderates. And if there are moderates, they have no future or any pull, so to speak, in that organization. And number two, that this organization that is built, whose constitution is really based around A, military activity, and B, a moral reform movement, you cannot expect rights-respecting, rule-based governance. And number three, I think not just 10 months, but 6-7 years of engagement with the Taliban have really produced not just positive results, but negative results. And so I think what we really have to do, and this is really a radical idea given the prevalent discourse, but it's not all that radical at all. And that idea is for the world to actually support the democratic aspirations of the Afghan people. Because expecting the Taliban to do human rights, to do women's rights, to do minorities' rights, is to expect, to use a cliche metaphor, a fox to guard the hen house. Not that hens don't have agency, they do, but I think that the need of the hour is, the more you you humor the Taliban, the more you engage in false narratives of let's give the moderate Taliban more time, let's give the Taliban more time to figure things out, the more you are actually prolonging a reign that is fundamentally unjust. And so the more you become part of the continuity of that unjustness. And I think in the long to medium term, the only viable option for 30 million Afghans who cannot realistically be resettled is to continue to pressure the Taliban for fundamental change in the nature of the regime, because what you've done is you've changed a constitutional system where the state and citizen have reciprocal rights and obligations, and you have now a Amir who is a semi-divinely inspired ruler, and people who actually pledge their allegiance to the Amir. And so in state citizen, the state derives its authority from the consent of these citizens. But in the Amir and subject, the subjects derive whatever safety they have from their allegiance to the authoritarian regime. And so you, by letting this system to perpetuate itself, you're fundamentally undermining the fundamental rights of these 30 million people. So I think the most practical in the medium to long term solution is for the international community, for academia, for journalists, for others to engage in conversations of how to transition Afghanistan back into that system. That transition is likely to be messy. There is no viable, clear alternative at the moment, but there are conversations. There are armed resistance movements. There are other diplomatic civil society movements. The Afghan parliament, for example, is planning to convene over Zoom. And so these formations are beginning to take shape, and they can be the basis for a future transition. Thank you.
If I could just add a footnote to that, today in Kabul, the Taliban leader, Maulawi Hibatullah, gave an extremely uncompromising speech, which showed no disposition to move on any of the issues of inclusivity or women's rights that people in the sort of peace industry and humanitarian industry had been hoping to see. And I think there's a lesson there, which is that if one's looking at the environment which can generate mass evacuations and mass populations flows, there is no room for self-delusion. And really one of the problems that led up to the collapse in Afghanistan last year and the evacuation and the population movements we've seen then was an enormous amount of wishful thinking of the dreamiest possible variety on the part of people who should have known better about the nature of the forces with which they were dealing. And there was a disposition at the highest levels of Western governments to see the problems in Afghanistan as conflicts of interest rather than conflicts of values, and a failure properly to diagnose what was the core nature of the problem has led to all sorts of disastrous consequences. And having said that, I think it's also important to recognize that the same problem haunts us now, that the problem in Afghanistan is not a technical problem or just a humanitarian problem, it's a fundamentally political problem. And it's not one that's going to go away by pretending that there's an independent central bank in Afghanistan to which the reserves of the Afghan bank held in Washington can be released. That is, again, delusional. And particularly when one's dealing with the lives of people who are at risk of falling victim to forced migration, there is simply no room for this kind of dreaminess. And some Western governments have an awful lot for which to answer, looking back at the way in which they comported themselves in the couple of years before the collapse.
If there are no further comments or questions from the audience or the speakers, if there's anything. Okay, then I think this is a very good point with those reflections, both into the future, but also on the lessons learned that Professor Maley has just summed up to us very importantly. Is for me to thank all the 5 speakers that were here today and the discussion for their wonderful contributions and extremely important and timely reflections on the Afghan evacuations. And thank you very much for the audience for their questions that got us discussing on those important points. So thank you very much.